inviting me. It's a really terrific conference, and I'm having a great time here. I'm going to pay attention to Jewish environmentalism, primarily in America, in order to illustrate the relationship between scholarship, faith, and activism. I will start with a short overview of the Jewish environmental movement in America, and then offer a collective portrait of Jewish environmental organizations, with some comparison to Jewish environmentalism in Israel. I will then say a few words about Jewish eco-theology, and ponder the charge railed against it that it reflects the re-emergence of paganism. I will conclude by identifying the challenges that confront Jewish environmentalism and suggest how to address them. So let's begin with a short history of Jewish environmental movement in America. Jewish environmentalism consists of diverse and rather decentralized attempts to reinterpret Judaism in light of environmental values and sensibilities in order to address the current ecological crisis from a Judaic perspective. The purpose of Jewish environmental organization ranges from advocacy at the national level to simply imparting a greater environmental awareness at the individual level. Environmental organizations can be found throughout the United States, but they are concentrated in the Northeast with substantial groups in Connecticut, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C., and in the West, namely in Arizona, California, and New Mexico. There are also groups that exist primarily as online communities, utilizing contemporary technology to affect social and personal transformation. Jewish environmentalism is Jewish because members are predominantly, albeit not exclusively, born Jews, because it justifies environmental work by appealing to Jewish religious sources, and because it seeks to affect the practice, attitudes, and outlook of those who define themselves in Jewish terms, whatever those terms mean. In the United States, Jewish environmental organizations collaborate with other faith-based or environmental organizations as they seek to articulate a distinctive Jewish position within global environmental movements. So I just gave you the definition. Jewish environmentalism in America began initially as an apologetic response to the charges of Lynn White Jr., his famous article from 1967, The Religious Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. It was published in the magazine Science. It's only 5 pages, and it's amazing how this little nothing article really created a whole movement. White claimed that the responsibility for the current ecological crisis, namely soil degradation, air and water pollution, rapid loss of biodiversity, extreme weather events, and exploitation of the Earth's natural resources, all of this lies squarely at the door of the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Bible, so he claimed, gave license to humanity to control the natural world solely for its own use and enjoyment. Jewish theologians from across the spectrum of modern Judaism retorted that White misinterpreted the biblical approach to the natural world and did not do justice to post-biblical rabbinic Judaism. The Bible doesn't give humans a license to exploit the natural world, but rather severely limits human interaction with nature, and more importantly, the Bible outlines an ethics of responsibility toward the natural world which God had created and enjoins humanity to be a good steward of creation. An informed reading of the Bible, so the argument went, and its subsequent interpretation within the rabbinic tradition shows that the Judaic tradition has much ecological wisdom, and that ethics of care or stewardship could serve as the basis for sound ecological policies. Now, during the 70s, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Reconstructionist rabbis began to explore the ecological wisdom of the Jewish tradition, but these reflections did not generate a social movement, so that's still in the 70s. The movement really began, I would say, only in the 1980s, when Jews who were active in the American environmental movement, most notably Ellen Bernstein from Philadelphia, sought to integrate their environmental commitment with their Jewish identity. 1983, the institutional structure of the environmental movement began to take shape with the founding of the Shalom Center. It was founded by Arthur Waskow, who at the time was on the faculty of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia. The Shalom Center's original mission was to address the nuclear arms race from a Jewish perspective. Yet the challenge was framed in ecological terms as a danger of planetary ecological disaster rather than the ordinary war-peace question. After the collapse collapse of the Soviet Union and the diminution of the nuclear arms race, the Shalom Center refocused its attention just on planetary ecological crisis, and Arthur Waskow became the leading voice of Jewish environmentalism. I assume that everybody in the room knows his name, right? I assume so. Although the environmental movement is not formally associated with the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Seminary or with the Jewish Renewal Movement, which was founded by Zalman Shabtai Shalom, I'll say more about Zalman later, in these institutions and their intellectual, religious, and social posture shape the spirit of Jewish environmentalism in the United States more than any other religious denomination or intellectual movement. Let me say a word about Ellen Bernstein. Ellen Bernstein was originally a Jewish rafting instructor in the Colorado River. And she was a key figure in the history of the Jewish environmental movement in America. She founded Shomrei Adama, the Keepers of the Earth, and under her leadership, a serious engagement of Jewish religious sources from an environmental perspective had begun. It focused on the agricultural foundation of biblical society, the natural imagery of prophetic oracles, the concern for nature in biblical legislation, the principle of respect toward nature in rabbinic law, organic symbolism and ritual practices in Kabbalah, the immanentist theology of Hasidism, and the return to nature in Zionist thought and literature. All of this actually began during the 80s under the leadership of Ellen Bernstein. By the end of the 1980s, it was quite clear that the resources of the Jewish tradition could support a reinterpretation of Judaism in light of environmental principles, but that it was necessary to raise the awareness of American Jews about it, because they still maintain that Judaism and environmentalism are either diametrically opposed or they are convinced that the long urban history of the Jews has generated a certain indifference to the natural world. So the pioneering work of Shomrei Adama was, they basically created the grassroots paradigm for environmental activism in America. A major turning point was 1990, the first Earth Day. And the first Earth Day, actually what we're going to have in America is not only some offshoot of that organization, just Shomrei Adama of Washington, D.C., but also the creation of Cojo. I'll say a few words about Cojo in a second. But before that, during the 80s already, 1984, it was the first challenge to Jewish environmentalism. It was articulated by Stephen Schwarzschild, a leading Jewish theologian and scholar who published a short essay entitled The Unnatural Jew, in which he questioned the main assumptions of the nascent Jewish environmental movement. First, the Jewish historical experience, he claims correctly, since at least the 10th century, the Jews were urban people, and Judaism did not develop an outdoor culture and did not engage in the veneration of wilderness or open spaces, which are so central to the environmental movement. More importantly, Schwarzschild argued that Judaism offers a major ethical critique to environmentalism, because Judaism denies the inherent sacredness of nature and instead offers a moral standard by which the amoral process of nature can be evaluated. In contrast to paganism, which deifies nature, Judaism takes care of the weak and the socially marginal, and doesn't allow nature to take its ruthless, competitive course. Judaism and environmentalism cannot be easily fused without serious distortion of Judaism's moral stance. That was Schwarzschild's argument in that little essay. Schwarzschild's critique was endorsed by Michael Wyshegrad's short essay on the topic, who was even more explicit about the disturbing fascination of Nazism with environmentalism and the Nazi view of nature as a source of morality. Whereas the Nazi worldview was profoundly pagan, Jewish ethics, and its concern for the weak and the marginal presented the most profound opposition to this approach. So to say that to put together Judaism and environmentalism was not as simple as it seemed to the people who began the Jewish environmental movement. One had to really begin to do some serious thinking. Anyway, Schwarzschild's essay generated serious debate within the environmental movement. There were some responses to it. I won't go through all the details of it. But a major turning point was the creation of Cojo. It was created in spring 1992 at the invitation of Al Gore and Carl Sagan. A group of leaders in American Jewish organizations were brought together to Washington, D.C., and the Coalition of the Coalition of the Environment and Jewish Life, or in short, Cojo, was created in 1993. Now, Cojo was supposed to just be a jumpstart environmental program that will bring together a new interest in it. But in fact, what's interesting about Cojo, it's one of the few organizations in America where you see 29 organizations from across the board in America, across the board of the Jewish spectrum, actually working together. That's a major accomplishment, I would say, in America. So Cojo promoted environmental education, scholarship, advocacy, and action in American Jewish community through publications, public education campaigns, conferences, Jewish environmental leadership development, and a legislative advocacy network. So environmentally speaking, it's the most important organization. Now there are other branches of Cojo. There's one in Southern California, there's one in Arizona, there are two in Canada, but in the last decade, we have some new organizations which are not directly related to Cojo. We have the Teva Learning Center, was founded in 1994. We have the Adama program of Isabella Friedman Center, established in 2003. We have Chazon, founded in 2000. Kanfei Nesharim, which is an interesting Orthodox organization, founded in 2003. Tel Shemesh, which is an online community, established in 2004. And the Shalom Nature Center in California, 2005. The bottom line, we do have a good number of Jewish organizations connected to environmentalism. I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about kind of a collective portrait of it before I go to the theology. It's very hard to determine how many people we're dealing with. And actually, I think that what we need to have is, I probably should hire a sociologist to really give us a sociological analysis of what's going on. There's no way to establish how many people are connected, in part because most of it is done on the internet. You never know if people who are participating in this particular program are actually committed environmentally. Somebody can go to something and then nothing happens afterwards. So we don't know the scope of the movement. I cannot tell you how many people are connected. Cojo has about 10,000 people. Well, I can say 10,000 people is not a trivial number, but I don't know the depth of the commitment of the people involved. If you ask the age, it seems to me the environmental movement usually have people, the environmental movement has people who are relatively younger, namely under 40. That doesn't mean that you won't find older people, but it appeals to people who are younger. If you ask me what is their intellectual orientation or Jewish orientation, many of them come from they're unaffiliated Jews. They come to the environmental movement in order to do something that they couldn't do otherwise. So they're definitely searching for something distinctive, and they get it through environmental activism. Now, of course, there are exceptions. Kanfei Nesharim is an exception to what I just told you. This is a distinctly Orthodox organization. It appeals and it works primarily in Orthodox day schools, and they are clearly dealing with people who know the Jewish tradition much more than a person who will be active through Cojo, let's say. We also have communities such as the Aleph group, which is of course part of the Jewish Renewal movement. And there you have people with different different level of knowledge, different level of commitment. But it's very hard to kind of get a handle on what is their intellectual commitment. I want to pay attention to one particular group which is somewhat connected to Aleph. This is Tel Shemesh, which offers a radical fusion or more radical fusion of environmentalism in Kabbalah. It's done mainly online. The goal is to create earth-based Jews and to reconnect the story of the earth through their Jewish experience. So they're trying to do something which is definitely part of the Jewish Renewal movement in America, and it's all done with Kabbalistic vocabulary and imagery, and I think we can definitely call it as part of the Jewish New Age movement in America. Maybe Boaz will have more to say about that point. In terms of activities, you find that the Jewish environmental movement offers a variety of activities. A lot has to do with nature education. A lot has to do just taking the Jews out of an urban setting and putting them in a natural environment and telling them, you know, there's more to Judaism than just what you think. So I'm going to skip some of the activities because it's not, you can figure out what that would involve. You can also get a lot of information on the web about all those groups. I want to say a few words about the ethos and the values of the Jewish environmental movement. Basically, there are three main values: responsibility, interconnectedness, and tikkun olam. Every literature you're going to read from this will come up with those values. And one of the problems that we have in the movement is to really explore the depth of the value. Everybody talks about tikkun olam, but what does tikkun olam really mean? So you go to some activity and you do something, and yes, you're metaken olam. So I've had a little bit of a problem with the movement because some of the cliches of the movement. Nonetheless, I think it's important to realize that the values that they represent are part of a much larger environmental kind of wherewithal or So the value of interconnectedness, for example, signifies not only awareness that humans depend on natural systems that support life, but also that by exploring the relationship between all created beings, and that include bears and red hawks and mosquitoes and blueberry bushes and mushrooms and soil, human beings recognize, I quote now, the unique role of each creature and element within the ecosystem. So that's kind of the value of interconnectedness. Of course, everything can be, you can find a proof text in a rabbinic text or biblical text, and so there's an attempt to tie this value to the traditional sources. One particular value which kind of, in terms of how to translate those values into action, is the concept of eco-kosher. It was invented or coined by Zalman Shalom in 1970s, sometimes in the 70s, and now this eco-kosher idea connects concerns about industrial agriculture, global warming, fair treatment of workers with the Jewish dietary laws about food production, preparation, and eating. Altogether, it's part of what we call eco-kosher. So eco-kosher is actually I would say, a full-fledged program of environmental justice, and it's implemented in all sorts of ways throughout the various religious movements, especially the conservative and orthodox movement, less so, I think, among reform. But I think it promises, it's something very promising. I do want to suggest two areas of impact or concerns that I have in terms of what's the impact of all this. Well, we're dealing here with grassroots movement, but the question is, who cares about it? To whom does it matter? And on the one hand, you say, okay, let's take Cojo. Cojo reaches many, many people. At least on their website, they will tell you that they reach many homes, communities, and congregations. I don't think that the impact of the Jewish environmental movement is that deep, to be honest with you. In fact, I think that there is considerable resistance still in the leadership of the Jewish community in America to the environmental movement. It is still a grassroots movement. It's still kind of a little bit off, even though some congregations and some movements value the notion of going green. We're not supposed to go green, all of us, whether we're in synagogues or day schools or organizations affiliated with Jewish federations or national organizations. But the truth is that the Jewish community in America has not absorbed the ethos of the environmental movement in a profound way. The situation is much worse, I would say, among academics, and I lament that. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's the first time that we ever dealt with the issue of Jewish environmentalism in an academic setting was 2003. That's the first time that the HAS found it appropriate to have a session on Jewish environmentalism. You can guess that they put the session in the last day, right, just before everybody rushes to the airport. And how many people were in the audience? 15. This is 2003. Well, we put together another session in 2008, and I thought, now this time I'm going to make it. How many people in the audience? Less than 10. So here we are at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, when it's very clear that environmental crisis is the crisis of the century, and Jews are not there. They're not there in the conversation, at least not Jewish academics. Now, why is that the case? First, the Jewish environmentalism is not concerned with the interpretation of canonic texts, which is still the dominant paradigm of the academic study of Judaism, and we all know when that began. Second, the very activist and advocacy stance of Jewish environmentalism is regarded with suspicion, and even with some derision. The very fact that the Jewish activists in the movement write for the general public rather than for specialists, and the fact that the books are published by semi-academic presses such as Jewish Lights publication, diminishes the intellectual credibility of writing about environmental matters. Not unlike Jewish feminism, 20 or 30 years ago, Jewish environmentalism is seen as an ideology whose goal is advocacy of certain practices rather than scholarship for its own sake. Now, this is not a trivial issue, the fact that Jewish academics are not yet on board with it. Most Jewish academics, including the people who participate in my volume, they don't really know the literature about environmental philosophy, environmental ethics, let alone the science of ecology. That's a whole other set of literature. So how to overcome that? That's, I think, a major issue. Now, I can say a few words about, if you want, but I don't know if we have the time. I don't have the time to compare it to Israel, and you will see some very interesting differences between Israel and America. I think that here you have a lot more done in terms of environmental activity, but the challenge here would be to use religious categories to address the environmental challenges. So yes, you do a lot of things here environmentally. The question is whether you do it Jewishly or whether it's done Jewishly. Obviously, the Heschel Center for Environmental Learning and Leadership in Tel Aviv is an example of an organization that attempts to create precisely that bridge between faith, activism, and scholarship. And I highly recommend that everybody will know about that activity of that institution. I'm sure many people do know it. So that's a good thing. In terms of what's going on in the Haredi community, the situation also is interesting. It's a little bit better than people may believe. If you're not familiar with the work of Yossi Shilhav and Moti Kaplan, I recommend that. They study the Haredi attitudes toward a range of environmental issues. And the picture that they provide is quite nuanced and complex. They show that while it's generally true that the Haredi community gives environmental issues a low priority, poverty and population density and other social issues shape attitudes toward ecological issues, which in Israel are considered part of the quality of life, things like that. However, it is not true that the Haredi community is oblivious to environmental issues. In print and in electronic media, there are independent newspapers that are relatively free of strict control. So I understand from them, I don't do it myself, so I don't know, I assume that what they say is correct. Their analysis of the journal Yeted Neiman, published between 1990 and 2000, showed significant interest in environmental issues, including water crisis in Israel, air pollution, extreme natural events, recycling, loss of biodiversity, open spaces, coastline degradation, urban landscaping, transportation, waste management, as well as climate change. So there is some awareness of what's going on, and that's quite promising. I can give you more information about other activities, but I want to skip to be sure that I remain within the time limit allotted to me. I want to skip and say a few words, a little bit about eco-theology. If there is a difference between the Israeli and the American communities, it has to do with the fact that I think in America we have a lot more theological activity. Now, why is that the case? We can speculate here. It seems to me that in America, United States Jews constitute a tiny, obviously that's the case, not just seems to me, but that's the case. We are a tiny, albeit influential religious minority, and we benefit from American religious pluralism and its unique congregational structure. So we operate in that way, and therefore our language, the medium that we use has to be theological. In America, theology is precisely the medium within which theory and praxis, faith and social action are integrated. The leading moral voices and social reformers in the United States were all religious leaders. And despite the formal separation between religion and state, it's a religious discourse and preaching that brings about social change. Third, even though many Jews define themselves strictly in ethnic terms in America, Judaism in America cannot express itself merely in ethnic or cultural terms. It must employ religious modalities. Thus, if in Israel Jewish environmentalism generates political, social, legal, and educational activism that revolves around the value of sustainability, in the United States, the creativity of Jewish environmentalism lies in constructive theology. Let me illustrate that, and I only will use one or two. The example for a real creative eco-theology is given to us in the thought of Heschel, Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Arthur Green, and Arthur Waskow. I think because of time, I'll actually focus primarily on the main, on Schachter and on Arthur Green. Everybody is familiar with Heschel, his concept of radical amazement. Heschel was not an environmental thinker, but Heschel's approach to environmental issues, Heschel theology could lead one to understand or to create a certain posture which leads to environmental activism, even though he himself was not an environmental activist. When you go to Zalman Schachter Shalomi, you see something quite different. Schachter Shalomi really understood, in that case he's like Heschel, that the radical crisis of the Holocaust requires a radical response and a thorough transformation of Judaism. But Schachter Shalomi's radical response is distinctively ecological, recognizing the need to heal the relationship of humanity with planet Earth. Schachter Shalomi called for a paradigm shift within Judaism that will not be, quote, a mere patch job of the old paradigm, but rather it will be a thorough reconstruction revisioning of the Parzufim, the interfaces between the infinite and Sof and the finite that we call the names of God, the root metaphors that will give us contemporary roles to play vis-a-vis the current demands of our lives and the eternal presence. That's all from Shakta Shalomi. Now, this radical paradigm shift entails a move from monotheism to pantheism, from dualistic to non-dualistic thinking, from patriarchy to egalitarianism. And it will come about only when, according to him, the aggregate of Israel, including women, develop a Gaian consciousness. So, what Shakta Shalom is about, or Zalman is about, is this Gaian consciousness. Obviously, that's a reference to the Gaia hypothesis, which Lovelock articulated in the 1960s. And according to the Gaia hypothesis, the whole Earth is basically a living organism. So what Shakta Shalom is arguing that we have to rethink ourselves as Jews and as members of this biosphere in communal, interdependent, and holistic terms. And the whole approach is designed in order to prevent what he calls the crime of planeticide, because that's what we're engaged in. We're killing the planet, and we're killing ourselves in it. Now, the Gaian consciousness is feminine, but it's not feminist. He does not believe in feminism, not in a technical or simplistic terms of equality between men and women. He actually believes in different roles that men and women, distinctive, diverse, and complementary roles that men and women should play within holistic, organic whole known to us as a human being. But I think that Zalman, of course, is one of the most interesting, creative, New Age thinkers, and unfortunately, it's not a systematic thinker. If you want systematic eco-theology, you have to go to Art Green. Both his book, Seek My Face, A Jewish Mystical Theology, that's 203, and even more, his new book, Radical Judaism, 209. And in those two books, he offers to us what he calls mystical panentheism, which he presents as an alternative to theism. And I think there's a lot of interesting use of evolutionary theory here. Now let me explain one thing. None of the thinkers, the Jewish thinkers, really know evolutionary theory in detail. They really don't get into the details of it, the depth of it. They kind of use it as a metaphor for the biohistory of the universe. But I think that the orientation is actually correct, and a lot can be done to move this insight that you have to think about Judaism in evolutionary terms, but really get into the nitty-gritty of evolutionary theory. So Green is a major thinker. I don't have time to get into the details. Arthur Waskow takes that. He's not a theologian as much, or if he is a theologian, he's doing it more in political coinage, and clearly offers us something quite interesting. I want to say just one word before I get to the conclusion about women. Where are women in the story? In fact, by the way, I was asked to give a paper here on Jewish feminism, and I said, look, I'm kind of tired of that. It's been around for 20 years. Let's do something new. But it's actually very important for us to think a little bit about the role of women. You may know that ecofeminism is a very important move, a very important strand within the environmental movement. So are there Jewish ecofeminists? Well, in America, yes. In fact, the leader of the ecofeminist movement in the world is a Jew. You may not know it because her name is Star Hawk. Now, she wasn't born Star Hawk. She was born in Brooklyn as Miriam Simons. And a very interesting woman, very, very interesting woman, whom I just met in Sweden, just 2 years ago in Sweden in a major conference that was supposed to prepare us to the Copenhagen agreement. And what she is saying, as many other ecofeminists are saying, is the following. Ecofeminism shares the assumption that the ideologies that sanction the exploitation and degradation of the environment are related to ideologies and practices that authorize injustice based on gender. So the foundational aspect of ecofeminism is the belief that for feminism to adequately address the realities and specificities of women's oppression, it is necessary to pay explicit attention to how the oppression relies on and fuels the devaluation of natural beings. Women are natural, therefore you can denigrate women. So she's working with that premise, but she takes it way beyond it. She defines herself as a pagan. She defines herself as a witch. She is the priestess of the goddess religion, and she is a Jew. And you may not know it, but she's a very active leftist Jew. She's involved in all sorts of protests. And right now, the state of Israel, in fact, does not allow her to come here. She's a persona non grata of the state of Israel, which does not make it makes it very complicated for people who know it. Anyway, she is the author, in case you don't know it, of the famous book Spiral Dance. And if you look at what she's promoting the same values that everybody else promotes: immanence, interconnectedness, and community. So kind of what's new. But she does it in some very interesting things. And what I'm saying, which I probably could not have said even 2 years ago, I say that we actually have to pay attention to her. We should not just dismiss her. It's a mistake to just say that she's irrelevant. We have to look at what she's saying, because for the following reasons. First, if we understand what she's doing, what she did, we realize the cultural trajectory of many Jews. Many Jews leave Judaism in America because they find themselves in those organizations, non-environmental movements. In her case, it's the Reclaiming Project, but she's the major founder of this Reclaiming Project. She really speaks like a prophet or prophetess. She has this passion. It's a passion for justice. And the same values that inspire her vision are shared by Jewish environmental movement. Other men who represent the same set of values are David Amram, a big name in the environmental movement, Gershon Winkler, and Jay Michelson, are not as famous as David Amram. All I'm saying is that we need to pay some attention to it. The other feminists, Rian Eisler, another very big name, very influential woman in the feminist movement worldwide. She's Jewish. She's a refugee from Austria, actually. Managed to get to, her family managed to get to Cuba. That she survived. A very interesting person who is a major player in the ecofeminist movement. I'm going to conclude now just by talking about pending challenges to the Jewish ecological movement. This is still a small but growing grass movement committed to the reconstruction of Judaism in light of environmental values and sensibility. The impact of the movement is still limited. While the official leadership of the Jewish community has paid attention to environmental crises, environmental issues do not stand at the top of the Jewish agenda. Similarly, Jewish academia in North America has remained largely uninterested. My heart is broken, but that's the truth. Largely uninterested in the environmental discourse and has not incorporated environmental history, philosophy, and ethics into its concerns. Although the Jewish tradition is replete with ecological wisdom, Jewish eco-theology is still in its infancy. To the extent that such eco-theology exists, it's a fusion of certain elements of Kabbalah and with the theory of evolution, but the intellectual viability of such fusion is yet to be proven, and more work is needed to put Jewish environmentalism on firm intellectual foundation. Now, given the enormity of the current ecological crisis and the fact that Jewish environmental movement attracts many Jews under 40, it is reasonable to assume that the movement will grow within the next 2 decades. However, we have some serious challenges. The main challenge, number one challenge to me, at least as I can see it, is the ethos of American society itself, with its rampant consumerism, social mobility, the love affair with technology, and the overemphasis on instant gratification, and its equation of happiness with physical pleasure. All these values pose challenges to Jewish environmentalism, no less than the internal weakness of American Jewry itself, namely the general ignorance of the sources of Judaism, apathy and indifference in the Jewish tradition of the Jewish tradition as a whole, widespread secularism, and adoption of the ethos of the Christian or post-Christian majority, and limited abilities to reinterpret the tradition creatively and authentically. So I know that sounds a very pessimistic look at American Jewry, but that's how I see. Number two, Jewish academia can and should support the Jewish environmental movement by providing necessary intellectual depth, without which the movement will not be able to survive or to thrive. I try to do my share in this regard. I'm working on this book on Judaism and nature, but obviously one person cannot do it. I would like to see more dissertations being written on Judaism and nature, and we do see here and there, one person writes in Penn, one person writes at York University. So we begin to have it, but we need a lot more attention to all those issues. We need a lot more scholarship done. A third challenge is to distinguish between the difference, what we call the old ecology, which is based on the balance in nature paradigm, versus the new ecology, which is the flux in nature paradigm. So the old traditional conservation movement was based on what we call old ecology. But now the awareness is that the story is complex, and the more you understand evolutionary theory and the more you understand the science of ecology, you see that it's not just simply let's conserve it, let's be good about management resources. It doesn't work that way, and we need to think it through. What does it mean to live in a world that is based on disorder and continual fluctuation rather than on balance? And it turns out that it's the feminists, Starhawk and Rian Asler, who understand that much better, I would say, than the male theologians. A fourth area of continued challenge is the creation of Jewish environmental halakha. I think in this case, better things are done here than in America, but there's room for a lot more work on that. And the final challenge, I would say, is to think through the relationship between Kabbalah and eco-theology. Even though Zalman has started it, Arthur Green continues, Wasco uses it, Jill Hammer, Gershon Winkler, they're all using Kabbalah, but I don't know how deep this project is. I would like to see it done with a little bit more intellectual depth. So to conclude, Jewish environmentalism is still in its infancy, although it emerged at the same time as Jewish feminism, when Jewish feminism came into existence, sometimes in the early 70s. The latter has been much more successful in generating a significant academic scholarship, new rituals, public policies, and constructive theology. Trailing behind feminism, Jewish environmentalism is yet to capture the imagination and emotional commitment of American Jewry. Perhaps because environmentalism is still seen as a non-Jewish issue for non-Jews to deal with, or because Jews fail to grasp the urgency of the situation or the urgency of the issues because it's inconvenient truth, as Al Gore told us. In the past century and a half, American Jews have struggled for inclusion and social acceptance, but of which mobility is a necessary and inseparable ingredient. But social mobility comes with a lifestyle, ethos, and values that stand in conflict with the environmental movement. It is unreasonable to assume that this ethos will change soon, not at least among Jews of a certain age. However, I do believe that organizations such as Chazon offers some hope for attitudinal changes among American Jews of a certain age, and there's definitely a generational gap within the Jewish environmental movement. The tasks of Jewish environmentalism then are formidable, but they're not insurmountable. These tasks could be accomplished more successfully if we increase collaboration between the Jewish environmental movement in Israel and in the American diaspora. The basic infrastructure of such collaboration exists. For example, collaboration between the Rava Institute and environmental organizations in the United States, such as Cojo or Chazon. But much more can be done, not only in terms of joint projects, but also and primarily in terms of college education, through exchanges of students and faculty, and integrated curricula of Israeli academic institutions concerned with environmentalism and courses. Same thing done also in the United States. I've been working to affect such integration in my own institution, but I admit that a lot more can be done. Perhaps the most promising work that is yet to be undertaken is the interaction between Jewish environmentalism and Jewish feminism, and with earth-based spirituality. The legacy of A.D. Gordon, as interpreted by the work of Einat Ramon, where is Einat? Right here. As I told you, I love your book, offers a very suggestive way of going about this challenge, but to affect the rethinking of Gordon for American Jewry will take a new fusion of faith, scholarship, and activism, along with goodwill, passion, and commitment. Thank you very much.